Okay, I want to kick off the discussion. So welcome everyone to our salon on boundaries featuring special guest Lily Scherlis. Thank you so much for coming. Um, DJ and Jamie, the way I like to do these salons is to ask you to introduce yourselves and why you joined. So I already asked you were interested by the topic and then you read Lily's essay. Would love to hear like what about the boundaries topic resonates with you. And if you had any like insights that you took away from reading the essay, please feel free to share. DJ, you go first.
Yeah, sure. So I'm currently in Arkansas. Um, let's see, let me think. So one thing, just in general, I'm kind of, as a sort of an older Gen X type, I'm kind of surprised but interested the way kind of Freudian stuff has made a comeback over the last 20 years. I mean, I guess if you're a Freudian, you may say it was never gone. But it was like so widely kind of believed to be discredited for the longest time that it was just kind of a curiosity. And, seeing something that wrote more kind of deeply with that was just interesting to me. In terms of boundaries, it's not something I think about it. It is something I had issues with in the past, but I don't think it was pathological. And it did help me to like sort of think in terms of my boundaries. Um, but they weren't, I wasn't like repeatedly ending up in bad relationships because of it or anything like that. There was just a few times when I realized, oh yeah, that's a place where I should have had stronger boundaries or respected their boundaries. And so, I did kind of modulate somewhat.
Thank you for sharing. Jamie, could you please share and introduce yourself?
Yeah, well, I'm Jamie. That's kind of it in terms of introduction. Yes, in terms of what kind of attracted me, it was more, I don't know, I kind of find the sort of historical fluctuations of pop psychology quite interesting in terms of how people understand both, uh, well, the kind of world they live in and the wider world and how they sort of place themselves into it and any kind of upheavals which can be caused by changes in that. And so in terms of how people are maybe abusing almost not, or at least for changes in use of boundaries terminology over time and how people are kind of using it for ever kind of widening circles is sort of at least interesting purely from a sort of historical viewpoint, I think, in terms of people struggling to express a particular thing which they maybe do not have like the verbiage for. But yeah, that's basically it.
Thank you for sharing. I'm gonna pass over Ola since they have their mic and camera off. But Lily, could you please share like what initially motivated you to write this essay, or like what sparked your curiosity in this investigation of boundaries?
I'm happy to do that. I did just see Ola's mic flip on, so if you would like to say anything, Ola, go ahead.
Yeah, I want to say I. Sorry, my cam is off. It's 1:15 a.m. here, and I'm using the last battery that I have to stay on.
Oh,
So I'm so tired, but glad to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us.
yeah, seriously. Um, Thanks everyone. This is all really interesting. So I started working on this piece in, I guess it would have been spring 2022, and a confluence of two things happened. So the first, maybe predictably, is that I got the dreaded setting a boundary text from a new acquaintance. Um, so I was at the time, it was so banal. At the time, I'd just taken on an editorship at Chicago Review, and I'd been becoming friends with this person. Um, and Basically, one of their friends applied for a job at Chicago Review, kind of through my new friend. I wound up rejecting that person, saw the rejected applicant at a party. That person was extremely cold to me, and I wound up being like, oh no. And I'd never really been in a position of being like a gatekeeper before. And so I kind of was like, oh God, I don't want to be responsible for making someone feel terrible about themselves.
Mhm.
And I managed that feeling by texting this new friend of mine who had so heavily encouraged this person to apply, who had said that they knew me, and basically was like, hey, like, do you think there are any hard feelings there? Like, I kind of was getting a
Mhm.
vibe. I want to make sure everything's okay. And my new friend texted back and was like, hey, I need to set a boundary. I don't feel comfortable with you bringing your professional relationship with my friend into our friendship dynamic. And I'm setting a boundary between these two things, and I need you to respect it. And I was like, what are you saying to me? I mean, I think I got it. Like, I really respected it. Like, I was like, I have caused this new friend of mine discomfort by putting them in the middle of a nebulous situation, in part as a way to like assuage my own discomfort with my own position. But I was like, what? A boundary? Like that feels like slightly like I was a little bit like something piqued my interest about that language, which I otherwise sort of wouldn't have noticed or would have taken in stride just because it felt egregious. And then
Mhm.
that same week, I was at drinks with a close friend whose dad had cancer. And this person's dad was having to go through a bone marrow replacement, like a total replacement. And I don't know how much you all know about that process, but basically it takes your entire immune system offline. Um,
Yeah.
and basically what winds up happening, as my friend was describing it, is your body loses its protective system, its boundary,
Mhm.
if you will. And you have to live in like I think it's like a negative pressure air bubble so that like viruses and particles can't get in that you can't fight off. But so I started thinking about like the limits of the body in a really different way through that, where I was like, oh, the edge of the body isn't like skin. It's not like a line we can draw around ourselves. It's
Mhm.
actually like a system. It's like a system
Mhm.
of molecules that are doing a bunch of different activities. And like that's how like what we think of as a line gets constructed. And that because like my friend's dad was like struggling to basically pay for this treatment is something that actually
Mhm.
has to be kind of like set up and propped up by all of these social systems that like collectivize care and in our current world do that very badly, but could
Mhm.
do it better. And so I was thinking about like how insanely complex the actual boundaries of like our corporeal beings are, how like
Mhm.
profoundly social, political, whatever, um, like actually like having something like a protective system around yourself is. And then I was sort of like thinking about that and thinking about this like weird thing with this friend. And I was like, what is a personal boundary? Like, where did we get that? And what really happened was I just kind of suddenly realized, like, oh, it's a metaphor. And I like
Mhm.
became like, obviously I knew that, but I suddenly became very sensitized to the image that was coming up in my own mind when I got that text, which was like of this new friend of mine. Like, and I actually have like I do a little bit of this in the piece where I kind of illustrate it, but it was like this friend of mine, like sitting in a field with a paint roller, like drawing a big, like kind of like sports field boundary around themselves. Um,
Yeah.
and being like, don't come here. And I sort of like started interrogating that metaphor a little bit. Like I was like, is that real? You know?
Yeah.
And then I started thinking like, and I think this is the case with so much pop psychology, is that it's like various forms of analogies that are telling historically that resonate with intellectual history and also political developments in very particular ways. I mean, like Freud, and I'm happy to talk more about like why Freud's back. I also have a lot of interest in that question because I'm also kind of belated to that resurgence. Or I think everyone in that resurgence kind of experiences it as like temporally indistinct. But I yeah, he has this thing where I think pretty early in his career, he says that it's the quote is something like, in the study of the psyche, we can only understand things by way of analogy, but we have to keep changing our analogies because they all get worn out. And
Mhm.
I just find that so resonant. It's like we cannot access this thing we call the mind as separate from the brain, except by creating metaphors for it. And all of these different
Mhm.
disciplines and all of these different ways of thinking, like, you know, have conscripted different sets of imagery into the project of articulating like what it is to be a person in relationship to other people. And
Mhm.
I thought that this one felt particularly sticky and particularly resonant, especially like in that moment in 2022, 2023, when like Jonah Hill's text came out. Um, yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing. Um, the idea of boundaries as a metaphor is something that really stuck with me when I read your essay. And the essay as a whole, in my interpretation, seemed to be arguing that like this metaphor of boundary comes from or is tied to all of these different disciplines, including like property logic, like political science, like the theory of like nations having boundaries and like cybernetics and stuff like that. Um, and what I took away, like implicitly, I felt that your essay was arguing that like maybe we need a better metaphor or like a more appropriate metaphor to think about our intimate relationships besides boundaries. Or maybe we need like a more like original metaphor that's like puts the way that we think about relationships first rather than like absorbing metaphors from different disciplines.
Mm.
Just a reflection that I had after reading. I don't know if that resonates with your intention.
That's so interesting. I mean, I'm associating to the concept in anthropology of the emic versus the edic. I don't know if people are familiar, but like this idea of concepts that like originate in the cultural context that's being studied, um,
Mhm,
versus concepts that are brought in, usually academic concepts, like bodies of theory that are then applied to that
mhm,
culture. So what I'm
mhm.
kind of hearing you suggest is like, what if we had like an emic metaphor for like interpersonal relationships rather than bringing one in from sort of other
Yeah,
fields? Um,
yes, yes.
I think that's super interesting. I mean, I'm kind of which is it's particularly interesting in light of the Freud quote because like psychology and psychoanalysis, of course, like are metaphor are disciplines that are built on metaphors borrowed from other disciplines. So it's like they're
Mm,
almost the ones that don't have their own like emic body of metaphors, though of course there are like I do think psychoanalysis has really built that out in a beautiful way. Um,
mhm,
I think that really what I'm advocating for is like I think I'm against a monoculture of metaphor, if that makes sense. Like, I think
mhm.
that what we need
Yeah.
is like to continually have a wide array of metaphors in play, like as individuals to
Mhm,
cultivate like a wide range of analogies that we can grab for rather than sort of relying on just one. Like, I think there's kind of like
mhm,
in the same way that like if you like over rely on one muscle, like or you like exercise and you work out one muscle and then you like leave the rest of your body alone, you're gonna get injured and lopsided. I think that when we rely on like one metaphor as the only one that we use to characterize our relationships or to sort of parse the complicated sets of feelings we have, the ways that we are grasping for control over like the really scary emotions that can come up in intimate relationships and also just in any relationships. Um, yeah, we just need to keep like a sort of wider set of tools on hand. And I think that this is like, I mean, I've developed a kind of obsession with systems theory because it is such it almost feels to me like a really sophisticated engine of that monoculture to some degree because it is a discipline that
mhm,
is founded on the principle of being able to analogize between all of these different disciplines. So it's literally like I think and someone else might be more of an expert on systems theory actually, but I think it really takes off in World War II when scientists from all of these different separate fields are having to come together to work on basically like military technologies and war machines and operations and are needing to
mhm,
understand how to speak to one another across disciplines. And so
mhm,
systems theory really develops like as this language where like everyone's research can be understood on the model of a system. And so it
mhm,
becomes this sort of template for thinking about like everything from like the human body to the family to like a warplane, like, and you can kind of, and so it's like everything becomes collapsible into everything else. And it's both kind of beautiful and
Mm,
also, um, creates like, I don't know. It creates kind of like this set of like boundaries is one of the key concepts of systems theory. And so it creates this sort of common sense set of ways of thinking that are both
mm,
extremely useful. Like I do
hmm
think boundaries are very useful as a metaphor, but that
hmm
also kind of collapse everything into this kind of common sense.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. That all really resonates with me. I have two insights based on what you just shared. Um, the idea of being against a monoculture really resonates with me, especially as that converses with the idea of like, we just need more tools. We can't just have this one set of tools. Um, and I say that because when I listened to your podcast interview, when you were talking about not only the boundaries essay, but also attachment theory
Hmm.
and like some of your critiques of that, I found myself as a listener being a little bit conflicted. On the one hand, because yes, there are many like examples of these tools being applied and abused in relationships, like the Jonah Hill text that you cited. But also, like, I am someone who found attachment theory and like the concepts of boundary super useful in my own interpersonal relationships because they make visible dynamics that I have that I couldn't see before. So yeah, I was conflicted there. But I love your idea that we just need more ways to like talk and think about our intimate relationships and to be flexible and adaptable because relationships are incredibly complex and dynamic. Um, what is interesting to me about your observation that systems theory really emerged during World War II is it gives me the question of like how much of our thought develops because of like our goals. Like if our goal is to win World War II, we're incentivized to like develop this school of thought systems theory so that these people from these different disciplines can communicate with each other so we can accomplish our goal. And yeah, I wonder if there's like a relationship between like these ways of thinking and violence and defensiveness.
Mm.
Mm. Yeah, totally. I mean, I think the thing that you said about how like boundaries, attachment styles, pop psychology concepts make elements of your dynamics and experience visible that otherwise would not be, like that's what a good concept does. Like it sensitizes
Mhm,
you to something that you otherwise would not be able to name and perceive in the world around you.
mhm,
And I think that it's like the more concepts you have ready to hand, like the more, I don't know, the better resolution you can get, maybe. Though I'm sure there's an upper cap on that. But I can actually kind of pull that to address this question you have about like how much of intellectual history is actually motored by like pragmatic aims, by political imperatives, by economic imperatives, which is like a heck of a lot of it, but for like what is a
mhm,
kind of, maybe a less Machiavellian reason than you might expect coming from like a leftist, which is that like people have to make sense of what's going on and people have to find
mhm,
ways to communicate with each other. And so they tend to turn to like the concepts that work to bridge gaps in perception. And those are the ones that tend to resonate with the common project of what needs to happen among people in order to survive and thrive in a given moment. So I
mhm,
think the answer is yes, but for this kind of same humble reason that like you grab onto something like boundaries or attachment styles and like
mhm,
feel like it is doing something for you.
mhm,
But I think that's like a very it's like a very pragmatist view, like I think like it like resonate like I feel like the American pragmatist, like this whole thing about like um what concepts like that the value of concepts should be evaluated not based on whether or not they have objective truth, but on whether or not they are useful.
mhm,
Um, like Adam Phillips has this amazing essay in the London Review of Books about Richard Rorty and Freud. Richard Rorty being this like late 20th century pragmatist or inheritor of the pragmatist mantle, who basically is saying like you should adopt the systems of belief or the concepts that get you the life you want. And
Mm,
then Phillips kind of has this like come back to Rorty, which is like, well, Freud would say, how the heck are you supposed to know what you want? Um, and like that sort of is the power of thinking with the unconscious, is that it helps teach us how like we think we know what we want. We want like money, we want things, we want people, we want da 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 da. But like a lot of the things we want, we are trained to want. And a lot of the things we want, we don't actually know we want. Like, which is sort of like there, we have all of us have all kinds of like self-destructive and perverse desires, what have you, which may or may not be conscious. And like psychoanalysis, I think, is really a way to name what's unknowable in the self, like the part of
mm,
ourselves that we cannot totally make sense of. Um, and like it's sort of it's this orientation of humility towards being a person that I think can be really beautiful. And I think that that is like there's the I think like Philip stages this like very beautiful conversation between like this like very relatable orientation that I kind of share in of like you should think about the world in the ways that help the world make sense to you in a way that allows you to live fulfillingly within it.
mhm,
Totally. And then like,
mhm.
well, how do you actually know what's going to be fulfilling? Because you're unknowable to yourself. And I think that like really for me, like truth emerges somewhere in like the push and pull of like the humility of Freudianism and like the pragmatism of pragmatism. Like
Mm.
I just talked a
I
lot.
no,
Well,
no. It's wonderful to hear you talk. You have a lot of interesting ideas.
Thanks.
DJ, did you want to jump in?
well, yeah, I just keep coming back to that text exchange. Um, and just again, thinking like a Gen Xer, like that would never happen if it were in person. It wouldn't be like, "Ooh, I got to put up my boundaries." It would be like, they would probably just say, "Ah, I
Mhm.
don't really feel comfortable getting in the middle of that." And you would
Yeah.
go, "Okay, yeah, I guess you're right." Um, I mean, I don't know. That's just my guess. And I'm always stunned when I see these like text message leaks. I'm like, why are you having an argument over text? Pick up the phone, talk to each other. And uh it's just like in a weird way, there's these boundaries we're not even, we sort of swim in now. Or not boundaries, they're barriers, right? They're low fidelity ways of communicating. Like every now and then I'll see some just absolute asshole on Twitter say something that's like really kind of like nice. They'll talk about how they went to the park with their kid. And I'm like, oh, that person who I just think of as this little avatar that I hate, who says things I really don't like, is actually a real human being. Um, who probably this is just kind of there's a really great Garrison Keillor. He had a book out years ago called The Book of Guys, and there's a short story in there about this old couple or like middle-aged couple, and like on around his family they're like the most progressive people ever. Like his wife has a lover that he's like, it's just fine, and his daughter's like boyfriend is like living in the house with them. But to blow off steam, he writes letters, like really racist letters to like the NAACP and stuff like that. That's like his outlet for this container he has for like what he really feels. I'm not sure why I really went to that, but the very idea of boundaries, I think, is a modern thing, right? I mean, I'm reading this book about medieval France, and the king, when they had state business, would literally they'd have the meeting in his bedroom. He'd just be sitting in bed, and that's how all the kings did it, because castles really weren't that
Mm,
big back then, and they weren't very well heated, and so it's just and people, whole families slept together in a single room. um, Relatively recently, turn of the century New York was like that. And now we have this separation that's come around from kind of abundance and technological, both technological and just material. And now we have these new psychological concepts that have kind of emerged to explain the unknown challenges that come with that.
Mm,
And I guess one last thing is I really don't like the rise of therapy speak in the last 10 years. People always talking about their trauma and their boundaries and their sort of things they learned in Psych 101. That's just a real turnoff to me for some reason. I feel like that itself is a way of kind of putting up a barrier. It's a way of sort of distancing because I'm using the approved professional language to describe this dynamic instead of just what we're going through together right now. So.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm interested in like the therapy speak thing. I totally agree with you. I think that like one of the first points I make is that like the language of boundaries actually shows up when someone is hurt and needs a way to communicate their pain. Like I think that there's like Lilia, what you were talking about was like in the making things visible thing, like there's something about sort of thinking to yourself, like, oh, I need to set a limit here. Like this person is pushing me, like they want all of my time, they want all of my, I don't, it's like, oh, wait, I need to give this person like a contour of like what I will and will not, you know,
mhm,
do for them, how much of my time and energy I will or will not allow them to sort of have their way with. But I think having that thought to yourself is different from like the speech act of being like, I need to set a boundary. And I think that sort of speech act and like the ways that we see therapy speak deployed a lot are these sort of ready to hand ways of saying, I am in pain and my pain has to do with you. And I think a lot
mm,
of the time when people use like reach for terms like that are like so in the culture and so popular, it's because they cannot find ways to name that pain or to characterize what might help with it or what they might need or what it might say about them or what it might say about the other person that are not, that are more specific because that involves like and not because they're dumb or lazy, but because it involves a lot of vulnerability to do it and a lot of sophistication and a lot of tools that we just like aren't given. Um, and I think there is this sort of arsenal of like band-aid language that helps people feel a little bit less like their lives are their fault. And I think that's an important thing. I think we have it hammered into our heads that our minds are our fault or our lives are our fault. So it's kind of no surprise that like therapy speak, forms of trauma discourse that swing very, very far in the opposite direction emerge kind of as like a dialectical counterweight to that. Um, But I think like there is something really powerful about being like, okay, I find myself wanting to like, imagining like saying like I'm setting a boundary and then to think like, okay, well, what's actually going on? Like what's sort of the next layer beneath this line I want to draw of like what is feeling not okay and how might I specify like the experience of that like in my body in relation, etc. Without reaching for this metaphor that might wind up being the right and useful metaphor in the end. But like maybe I can take a moment and sort of think more specifically before I like reach right for it.
mm.
Lilia, I'm curious if you have thoughts about the technology stuff. I think you're like probably about my age. I maybe have a few, but I kind of want to know what you think.
That was going to be my next response. I love that DJ brought in this like generational difference. Because I think, DJ, you're right in observing that we're experiencing more and more separation in the physical world due to technological and material abundance. Yet I also kind of feel like, ironically, in the digital world, we're overconnected to each other. And I wonder if like latching on to boundaries as a metaphor is a response to like a need for less connection. Like I I don't want all of these texts. Like why am I now like getting texts and having like aversion responses to them? Like it used to
Mhm.
be so fun to like be able to chat to my friends whenever I wanted to, and now suddenly it feels like, overwhelming, like too much information. I'm hearing too much noise. I'm hearing too much like conversation online. That's a very personal response, but yeah, I think we may be a little, at least for myself, maybe a little too connected online, and so that's tiring.
Anyone can intrude into your mental space at any time.
Yeah, but like for me, I have a difficult relationship with it because I always want to take as much responsibility as I can. So in my personal relationship to the concept of boundaries, it's almost like I've weaponized this concept against myself. Like, whatever mental torment I'm experiencing, it's because I don't have strong enough boundaries. I'm not like defending, or
Mhm.
like, I don't know my boundaries. I'm not defending them self enough. Like, my boundaries are too weak for me to be on social media. And then it ends up becoming something that I like almost punish myself for.
Yeah. I mean, this is like the problem of so much self-help, right? Is like you read this book, or like more often you see this tweet, or like watch this TikTok, or like hear this thing someone's telling you, and you think like simultaneously, like, oh my God, if only I had that, my life would be fixed. Like this is an escape route. I have this new tool. I'm gonna like, start this new habit. I'm gonna like set boundaries. I'm gonna whatever. Um, say the phrase let them, and you're like, you feel this glimmer of hope. And then simultaneously, you feel this feeling of, oh God, why am I not doing that? Why can't I do that? Like you're sort of
Mhm.
struck with your inadequacy in the present while also being offered like a possible fix for it. And then after you know this concept for a while, you're like, oh, like, why don't I have better boundaries? Why am I forgetting to like say let them? Why am I, like, and it becomes this form of self-beratement because you feel like you've been given this tool that should have fixed your problem, and yet you don't feel yourself to be like practicing it adequately. And so it becomes this
Mm.
way of being hard on yourself.
Thank you for letting me off the hook.
That's like kind of what I live to do. Like I say as like a person who is quite hard on myself in my own particular ways. So, I think it's yeah.
I was I was telling a friend at a dinner party that I was hosting the salon, and they had a similar thought about boundaries as a less useful metaphor for like the exchange of dependency and support that relationships require. Um, and a metaphor that they proposed as an alternative was having like a connected root system, like in plants, and how plants can like send nutrients to different parts of the root system depending on need.
Oh, are they into Deleuze? Has a real like rhizome thing, like I mean, so it's like it's really interesting because the people who are like really staunchly anti-boundaries are like new left philosophers from like the 60s, so like Norman O. Brown in particular, but like, it's like I feel like the Deleuze-Guattari thing is like so like what if we erase all of the lines and everything flows into everything else and everything becomes horizontal and we reject striation and we, like deterritorialize and reterritorialize. And I think like there's like a little bit of like you know, on the one hand, I am very sympathetic to like, let's abolish property. On the other hand, it's like there's like a little bit of a like, okay, you can't just be on LSD all of the time. Like,
Yeah.
so I kind of love like I love the root system metaphor, but it's so interesting because like that is like I feel like the like primary like Deleuze-Guattari like way of like alternate metaphor, like the rhizome, the root system, etc.
Interesting. What is this rhizome concept? I don't think I've heard of it before.
Oh God. Is anyone here a Deleuzian? Jamie, you're smiling. Maybe you know. I will. I do not enjoy paraphrasing Deleuze. But I think the emphasis is sort of instead of sort of like vertical, rigid systems, they prefer to sort of understand or interpret society as sort of like a horizontalized network of responsiveness. Someone else can probably narrate this better on the
Mm.
call, but this is not my subfield. Mm.
I think you might be the only person who knows what this concept is. So, regardless of how well you're articulating it, I appreciate the introduction.
The universe is like a root vegetable.
I was going to say at the beginning, you were talking about like this metaphor of boundaries, or systems theory. I'm sorry, you're talking about systems theory. Another thing that's sort of I hear about a lot is like everything is computation.
Mhm.
That's
Yeah.
more, I mean, that's obviously because of LLMs, that's been a big thing. But even outside of that, there's ideas around biological computing, how the body is really
Mhm.
just one giant computer. Um, and and more recently in economics, there's a field of economics called computational economics, which is less about a spreadsheet where you change the variables and it's not like that. It's more like you have to run the simulation, and weird things happen when you run the simulation. You can't predict in advance what they'll be.
This is such an important point and really interesting point. And like what I will say is that like most of my work in the past few months has been focused on specifically computational metaphors for psychological well-being. Because there's a ton of work in neuroscience around like predictive processing, is like a kind of more recent school of neuroscience that relies on a lot of these metaphors. But it's actually really interesting because that whole way of thinking goes out of systems theory. Like modern computers as we know them have a really intimate relationship to the development of cybernetics, which is like a, as you probably know, like a discipline of thought that is intimately related with systems theory, but specifically is interested in opaque systems. So systems where we can't know what's going on with certain components of them. So like there are black boxes involved, like which is often a way of managing people because people are black boxes. You do not know what's going on in here. And you can maybe characterize it, but maybe better to sort of leave it as a variable. Um, so, which is kind of what's happening when we're talking about like, the thing you're saying about like computational economics, like all of these calculations are happening that you cannot see and cannot characterize, but they're factoring in some way and we need to like know how to account for them. Um,
Mm.
and I mean, so many of our metaphors throughout history, like for human experience, are like deeply enmeshed with our technology and technological development. Like, um, this philosopher like Nicholas Steno in the 17th century like said like the mind is like a machine, and of course like what he meant was like a weird contraption, and that is not something that we might recognize as a machine today. um and now we think like, oh, like not only is artificial intelligence like natural intelligence, but the mind is like an LLM, you know um and so you can totally track the development of these pop psychology metaphors with the machines that we are using and that our lives are enmeshed with, which totally makes sense.
Yeah, it just goes back to what you're saying of like we need concepts from a pragmatist point of view to understand what's going on. And usually what's going on is these technological developments that are like fundamentally changing our economy, like our relationship to
Hmm.
work and like the skills that we need to have to survive. Yeah. But I don't know. I continuously go back to this idea of like what would happen if like the way that we think about ourselves, our self-awareness, our needs, our relationships, that was like the primary subject matter for the development of metaphor. Maybe we would have different machines.
Whoa. I mean, I think it is a feedback loop. Like that's like neural nets, like
Say more.
we pull on one for the other constantly. Like we're modeling our machines off ourselves. We're creating
Hmm.
computers that work like we think the brain works. And then we're like narrating the brain and therefore modifying our brains on the basis of how those machines wind up working. So it like
Mm,
is this weird symbiotic cycle. Like you're
mm,
totally on to the thing. Like it's super, super
yeah.
interesting.
Like we're in a co-evolutionary relationship with our technology.
I think so.
Yeah.
although at times
Yeah.
it's dysgenic.
I think it is super, 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 super dysgenic right now. But I think
Yeah.
it's like interesting because like if you look at like human evolution, like and like the emergence of tool use and how like profoundly essential that is to like how our bodies wound up developing, like over like hundreds of thousands of years, like even millions of years, I think. I think there's like evidence that like that members of the Homo genus were like using tools at like 2 million years out or like something insane. Like the old divide tools or whatever. Um, like we are completely co-constituted by technology, but sometimes that technology is like a rock.
Well, I think a lot about like moral development. Um, like I said, I've been reading. It's a distant mirror by Barbara Tuchman. It's about the period of the Black Death and immediately following that. Which is the beginning of the Hundred Years' War, and and it's just so shocking how brutal people were to each other back then, and uh, just how murderous and just really just awful to each other, and especially if you were the boss. And it's the kind of stuff that just shocks our senses, and and you wonder, is that the state of nature? Is like that, would that immediately come back? Let's say we had a end of the world as we know it kind of event, and suddenly we're without all the systems around us. Would we immediately regress to that, or has there been some kind of a step function in our moral intuitions that
Hmm.
Mm.
prevents us from going back to that? Um,
Are we fundamentally eusocial or antisocial?
yeah, and like think about like the Neanderthals and whoever what's that, the short people that were in like Java or something, a couple 100,000 years ago that died out. That was most likely a genocide, right? They probably just killed them all off. I don't think, when they say selection pressure, it was
Yeah.
like who could wield a spear better. Um, and that was probably just like, oh yeah, of course, you kill them all. You see one, you kill them. That's the natural state of nature, is we kill them.
And I mean, that's all about boundaries again, too, right? Because it's like who's the in group and who's the out group. And like, I think, like my knowledge of human evolution is spotty, but like, I think we are pretty programmed to be eusocial with the people we consider to be the in group, even if that in some societies is just limited to our family or just limited to
Mm.
ourselves, as in like hyper neoliberalism, like, um, but like, it can also be like, a massive community. Like some people are defining like America as the in group and then drawing the line there and then like managing all of their like paranoia by like projecting it onto like undocumented people, like so it sort of is like at least for me, it's sort of like I feel like we are like fundamentally eusocial to whoever we categorize consciously or unconsciously as members of our community. And we don't always know where we as individuals are putting that line. We might think we know and we might
Mm.
not. And then can be extremely violent to everyone outside of that line. And I think that like a lot of like in the present, we export a lot of that violence. So like we are, I think, kind of just by moving through the world, like complicit in like mass death elsewhere. But we don't
Mm.
see it and we're not doing it with our hands or our words. It's kind of just happening as a byproduct of like our energy use, for instance.
Mm.
Um, and we don't really have control over that. Like we could maximize or minimize our complicity, but we can't fundamentally like divest ourselves from those processes or systems.
Mm.
Um, so it's like I think it's just become, I don't think we've necessarily changed. I think it's just all become much, much, much harder to make sense of and parse because the world has become so complicated and has like become like human systems have become so enmeshed and gnarled and complex and exploitative on mass scales, and we cannot even really perceive it as individuals in clear ways anymore.
I buy that take, Jamie.
Thanks.
Mm. Yeah, well, I'm just trying to think of words. Like several kind of years ago, I read something basically saying don't listen to like a lot of dating advice because a lot of like pop psychology was in it because a lot of it comes from New York, which is especially kind of weird in America in terms of it's like the most gender ratio big city, and it's just weird in a lot of ways in terms of people moving constantly, and so that you don't have a kind of constant community which you do necessarily in many other places. So, in terms of reason, but obviously New York's up for sort of main media kind of hub for America still, at least to my knowledge. I'm not from there, but obviously the sort of boundaries kind of concept is at least kind of working with people who you don't know especially well and who you may have been coming into contact with for the first time. And so is it kind of more New York kind of almost focused or big city focused way of looking at things than how we kind of view things in the past? Like, I've just dabbled in like 19th century socialist literature, and that always kind of imagined a post-capitalist society as a kind of rural thing where the cities would be abandoned. So is like this whole boundaries pop psychology takeover, is that just for natural reaction to people congregating in cities, which is an almost unnatural way of life, and people are still struggling to ways to kind of accommodate themselves to it?
I'm fascinated by this question. Um, I think I do have fantasies of like, post-capitalist or just post-systems collapse cities, like finding sort of ad hoc ways to have like mass population centers. Like I think I am actually really interested in that and don't know very much about like the thinking that has been done towards that, but I would really, really like to. Um, I mean, I don't know. Yeah. Does anyone have a knee-jerk response to that? I'm curious what other people think.
A knee-jerk response to the
Are
question.
boundaries just for metropoles? I mean, I think they definitely like are to some degree. I mean, I like full disclosure, I have never lived for longer than a couple months outside of a city. And I think
Mhm.
that's probably true of like a number of people that I come into contact with on a daily basis. Like I've only lived in New York for a year. Um, I'm having a hard time differentiating the social logic of boundaries in a metropole at the scale of New York that is like home to the US culture industry to this degree, at least like, besides Hollywood, from like how it plays out in Chicago. I do think there's this way that like in New York, social life is very, very, very containerized. Like I have a lot of friends who are like longing for forms of sort of like, someone to just come ring their doorbell and come hang out. And like that really like at least in the shape of my life doesn't exist here. Like people have that with their partner. They might have it with like one friend who lives up the block. And then like everyone else, you're like scheduling like a catch-up drinks for 90 minutes, 2 weeks in advance. And like, so I think there is this like very, very, very partitioned mode of life that exists in New York that is like slightly less the case in other cities. And I think that is one thing I miss about Chicago. But I think it exists more in terms of like it really exists in the relationship to time. I think that's very
Hmm.
clear. Um, I don't have a strong theory of how that extends to pop psychology. I think if anything, I see people really straining against it in my immediate universe. Like people like one of my acquaintances like bought a landline phone so that anyone can call her at any time when she's at home and come over. Like it's like I feel like I see people creating all of these like strange contraptions and contrived ways to have a less like atomized and containerized existence. And I'm wondering if that is, the dialectical antithesis of the obsession with boundaries, or is a part of it, or is, it's like I think with every one of these concepts, it's not like like there's never just one. There's always like a push and pull of like the thing, the opposite reaction to it, the opposite reaction to that. And I think that like boundaries can often sit on both sides of like some
Hmm.
complex dynamic, but I have no ability to speak to like what it is like to encounter pop psychology from a rural area. What I will say is that and I realized I was like, someone else tell me what you think. And now I'm just like talking through this out loud. But like, is that one of the early, and this is in the piece, but like one of the key early boundaries text is by these two, like, I guess it's like Christian philosophers or therapists or something, who I believe live like in the West in a pretty rural area and are like, you should think about relating to other people as you relate to like your plot of land. Like if you demarcate
Hmm.
your property line, like the property line around like the self, then
Hmm.
that will like facilitate an easier relationship to your neighbors. And so I think on some level, like there is this paradox where like the whole metaphor of boundaries is very much based on land ownership, which is a thing that no one I know in New York has. They definitely do not
Hmm.
have yards. Um, and so there's almost something that's like obsolete in like the lives of everyone I know about like the concept of having like a fence around your yard. Like it's just an absurdity, you know?
Hmm. Hmm.
But that almost feels like maybe why boundaries are so popular in cities right now is because everyone's like, at least my friends are all like renters who could get like priced out of their apartments at any time. No one feels like they have any control over actual literal space. And
Hmm.
as like water levels rise and encroach upon the city itself, like, and so there's almost this desire to compensate in relationships and in mental dynamics. So that is my tentative answer.
I mean, I grew up in a pretty rural area in Georgia, very rural. But what that means is you have to take a car to get to do anything, right?
Hmm.
Neighbors didn't poke it. Well, we did have a neighbor who would bring up like they had a big garden. They'd bring up like tomatoes and things like that, in the spring. So I guess there was a little bit of that going on. But uh, yeah, and I imagine parts of Europe are different. They're maybe a little more sort of walkable or used to the idea of just like getting on a bike and going somewhere instead of driving a giant car. I don't know, um, but it's funny because you say, yeah, a yard with a picket fence. I mean, we had 45 acres. You had to drive down a long driveway to get to our house.
Yeah.
So that seems kind of weird to me too. Yeah, I mean, whatever I would see on TV, neighbors just dropping in to say hello to each other, I was like, oh man, that would be so cool to live somewhere like that. Um, but I can't.
We're really talking about suburbs, huh?
Yeah, basically, yeah.
I don't know. There were a lot of entangled concepts in Jamie's question. Like, I'm kind of still stuck on, are metropoles unnatural? And is that why we
Uh-huh.
have this like unnatural concept? And then also like how unnatural can the concept of boundaries be if we just establish that like the in-group out-group mentality is like fundamentally wired into our instincts? Like
Mhm.
so I don't know. That was a cop-out response. That was a cop-out response, but I don't know. It's like it's hard to untangle a lot of these things. And I also wonder like how much of the way that we or like the way of socializing that you're describing, Lily, of like we're blocking out 90 minutes 2 weeks in advance. Like how much of that is urban and how much of that has to do with like a professional class, like a certain professional class or like a certain like level of wealth and like how much of that is like also tied into living in a city. I don't know, it's hard to disentangle. And I also think that like now with the introduction of the internet, like these concepts are just everywhere, you can live wherever. It's more about like what space online do you occupy. So yeah, I
Just
don't
to
know.
amplify that, yeah, I've thought about that a lot. I remember, I mean, about 15 years ago, thinking, you know, I mean, I was still like in my 30s, but I thought, I'm growing old at a time that it's good to be growing old, right? I can still stay connected to the world. Um, my dad would just sit around and watch cable TV, but I get to like participate in things like this. Uh,
Hmm.
and uh, So on one hand, I think that's great. On the other hand, like, why can't I have this conversation here where I live right now? I mean, it's a college town. There's a lot of smart people. Why can't I find those people and, have similar conversations? And part of it is it's just easier, right? I can sign up for Internet Elect and get email notices and just go do it that way. And the monoculture is pretty much dead except for, like, I don't know, the Super Bowl, you know, and maybe the Taylor Swift tour or something, But uh, now we have all these microcultures and they're just like they span the continents. And I think that's like probably good for human development, but I'm not sure it's good for local communities. You know?
I'm curious whether people think, I mean, my impulse about self-help is that it weirdly is one of the zones where like some sense of the monocultural
Hmm.
like lingers a little longer. Like I feel like
Okay.
self-help concepts have a tendency to cross political divides, which is sort of why we're seeing like I don't know, I mean what Naomi Klein writes about in Doppelganger, like this sort of like far out to far right pipeline. Like there's this weird way that like the ways we actually talk about our relationships and our personal lives, like those bodies of metaphors, like I think commute a little more than we think they might. And I'm
Hmm.
very interested in that. I haven't done a ton of research there, but I'm curious about others' instincts with respect to that.
I think that's probably true, but even that is becoming politically coded. Um, Derek Thompson, he posted a couple weeks ago this survey. There's like a common sort of political thing is to say that people on the left have more mental illness. They report more depression, they report more neuroticism, poorer mental health, right? But if you ask the question about mood, like what's your mood like yesterday and today, and what's your overall mood, it just disappears, the difference between left and right. And so it's like the words mental health are a code. Like only the left cares about mental health. That's, weak soy boy stuff. Um, and so and like you're talking about with the doppelganger thing, yeah, the sort of uh, diagonal pipeline from I just want to eat organic food to Bill Gates is trying to implant a microchip.
Hmm.
It was um, it was really shocking to watch in real time as it was happening, but
Hmm.
it kind of makes sense. And now they have their own language, the Maha language, seed oils and all that kind of stuff that was kind of cross-cultural until a few years ago, or cross-political, I guess you could say.
The idea that the left might have more therapy speak in the way that they relate to their emotions does strike me as resonant. Like that resonates with me, but I'm not an expert. Yeah.
It's interesting because, like, I mean, so it's like Trump has this whole relationship to like the power of positive thinking. Like Mark
Hmm.
Andreessen booked this book, The Courage to Be Disliked. Like, there's sort of this funny
Mm,
way that like prominent people on the right are much more willing, weirdly, to affiliate with self-help in a kind of strange
mm,
way. Whereas, like, if you try and find similar situations where like prominent people on the left like thinkers and politicians, like anyone who like qualifies as like a pundit or an authority, they will not admit that they've touched self-help with a 10-foot pole a lot of the time.
mm,
So there's kind of like I find that fascinating. Like I think there are like different concepts for different sort of like micro cultural niches.
mm.
But I don't know.
There was a great essay. She did a salon. I'll have to go find it. It was for the Point magazine, and it was called like, First Boys at the End of History or Lost Boys at the End of History or something like that. And it was about she went to one of these like turning point type events, and strictly on it just as a reporter, like asking questions. Why are you here? Why do you like MAGA? And the
Mhm.
thread that sort of ran through a lot of it was she sort of compared it to what's his name? What's the actor? Timothy Chalamet. He made
Mhm.
some comment right around Oscars time about how he wants to be great. He wants to be like reach for greatness or something. And a lot of people sort of clowned him on that, like, oh, that's so cringe, wanting to be great. And and she's like, but that's the kind of language they speak at these kind of right-wing events, is like, you know, try to reach the apex of excellence and things like that. And it gets channeled into really weird ways and strange obsessions. But there is something to that. Like, why wouldn't you want to try to be like the best person you can be? Um, and the left is so like flinches at that kind of language. Um, and that would sort of explain also kind of the gender divide. That's a very masculine kind of um, trait as well.
Ambition.
Yeah, exactly.
What is it? Who's willing to avow it? Who's willing to disavow it? Who's willing to avow it with respect to some things and not others? Like, when is it collective? When is it individual?
Yeah, I gotta find that essay. It was very well written.
I definitely struggle with ambition. I'm now rethinking my entire relationship to self-help.
Do say more.
I don't know. Like, I think I recently started identifying within myself this desire for excellence, like this desire to, this innate ambition, I guess. Like, I want to be a great writer. I want to be a great artist. Like, I want to have like an excellent life, like surround myself with great people. Um, I want to show up in relationships to the best of my capacity.
Mhm.
I want to like not inconvenience or like hurt the people around me. Oh my gosh, I'm getting so personal. Well,
Oh,
sorry. Um, but yeah, I think that's why self-help resonates with me because of this ambition to be like the best person I can possibly be. But I think a lot of that is also tied into perfectionism. And I appreciate the skepticism towards self-help of like, it can put you in a position where you're constantly evaluating your own inadequacies as like a marketing tool to get you to like buy a certain concept or like buy advice. Um, and I guess now I'm reflecting on like what my personal, like what that might say about like the actual weaknesses I have to overcome in myself, you know?
I really resonate with that. And I'm having this like, I'm just like running through mentally this list of sort of terms or metrics. Like I'm thinking about like what is the difference between, okay, let's see, like being good, doing good, being enough, having a good life, living well, having good relationships, being good to others. Like these are like they're all slightly different phrasings of like things we might mean when we talk about something like excellence or things we might want, and they all have like subtly different entailments. And I think that like at least for me, like stuff gets very messy when I start to collapse things into either like the having phrases or the like being phrases. And I think like there's like I kind of have this desire to like stay with the verbs a little bit. Um,
Mm.
I don't know. I think it's like the anxiety is about like this idea that there's some core inside of you that is like it's like you have like a meter of development, and that's slowly what you're doing is just filling up that meter, and then eventually it will be full and you will be good. And while it's still empty, there's something toxic or bad or wrong or inadequate. And like I think it becomes
Yeah.
very easy to start to think in that way. And I'm kind of like, what does it mean to live a life that is like full of growth, full of development, full of change, that is like continually like moving from one way of being to another way of being, that is not predicated on this sense of like running from something, which is what I
Mm,
often slip into, like when I start to like read a lot of self-help uncritically. But
mm.
I mean, I
Yeah.
went through a stage, but a few years ago, I realized, I'm good enough. I don't need to read anything. It was actually a very good feeling. It's like, I still have my problems and my challenges, but I'm good, you know,
Good
good enough.
enough.
Yeah.
did something
Better's the
prompt
enemy of
that?
good.
Hmm?
It's yeah, there you go. Did something prompt that? Like, was there a moment?
I don't think it was a moment exactly. I did a fair amount of therapy and I actually got a lot out of it. Some people say, oh, it's a waste of time or I hear horror stories about therapists. I'm like, no, I always had my therapists were fine. I had like a few of them. Um, and every now and then I'll see some like, I don't know, airport cover about, whatever weird thing is. You stop procrastinating or stop. And I realize I either already kind of know, like, oh, that's something I've already kind of solved, or I realize that's all just a hustle. They're just trying to make you feel bad about something that you don't need to feel bad about. And so, I still learn things. I still learn skills and things like that, but I don't really feel like I need sort of personal help with like understanding myself or relationships or things like that. I will say, I mean, honestly, the book I got the most out of, two books. One is the book Getting Things Done, which is just about how to organize better. I always had organizational instincts, but that gave me kind of a way of thinking about getting organized. And the other one, I'm hesitant to say this to women, is The Game by Neil Strauss. It's about pickup
Oh,
artists. Came out in 2006, I think. Um, and it's about this guy who's this sort of dweeby, can't get a girlfriend. He starts hanging out with these pickup artists and becomes like fabulously successful at it. But if you read and the first half of the book is it's pretty manipulative, the stuff they learn, Um, but you have to read the whole book because the whole book, he says like, look, ultimately, I mean, women have preferences and they're all different, but what's generally attractive is confidence, right? Is just being a confident person, right? And when you tell a guy be confident, that doesn't mean anything. Like, what does that mean, confident? You know? And so you learn there are things you can do that make you look confident, right? But after a while, you internalize them and you just simply are confident. And that's kind of the arc of the book. He's like, I started out kind of pretending to be confident, and it caused a lot of problems, because I was pretending. And then one day I realized that I was just being me and I was naturally more attractive and just life got easier. So I really liked that book. It was, he's a fantastic writer too. So.
Respect.
totally.
Respect.
I mean, I think something that I find of interest here is like this, like the very subtle distinction between like finding a self and and what you called manipulating others, or just sort of like finding ways to operate other people to get the kinds of responses you want.
Mhm.
And like, I don't know, I mean, I think that one of my friends was I got into this conversation with a friend about the idea of soft skills and like whether like interacting with other people is something that can properly be thought of as a technical skill. Which I think at a very basic level, like yes, up to a point. And then you have to let go of sort of ideas of technical mastery and like attune yourself to the existence of like another subjectivity, which is a kind of crazy and radical act, you know. And everyone's gonna feel weird when that starts happening. But I think that she was basically saying, well, like what's really interesting is like a lot of my guy friends got really into pickup artistry specifically because like they were people for whom socializing didn't come easily and like they were never taught and like women who felt that way like would find like would like be like WikiHow, how to make friends. But like men got funneled into like as teenagers pickup artistry as a set of protocols for how to interact with other people. Those other people like happen to be like, of course, like sexualized women, which are the other people that men are being told they need to be virtuosic at interacting with or develop anxiety about interacting with. So that kind of makes sense. But like
Mhm.
she was kind of boiling down pickup artistry at base to like a toolkit for people who feel uncertain of how to like approach others at all, to feel like there are some guardrails around like how do you begin to do that and feel like you're doing it the right way when it's like such a nebulous thing to put yourself out there and like because of the need or the craving for like some sense of guidance and how to approach others like you wind up with this whole cottage industry of stuff that can be like profoundly misogynistic and can teach modes of relating that are like really pathological, but also like I deeply sympathize with this like basic desire for someone to tell you like how to be a person among other people or to like have some sense of like norms in that space.
There's a really great blog post by Scott Alexander about 10 years ago. Do you know who he is? He's one of the rationalist guys. He writes Astral Codex 10. He's a fountain. He can just like crank out 10,000 words on anything. It's unreal how much this guy writes. Um, but he wrote a post about how, he struggled with women and, he didn't want to be a nice guy. He wasn't complaining about I'm a nice guy. Why don't girls like me? But what was confusing to him is he's actually a psychiatrist and he dealt with this patient. He was like in his residency at like a prison or something. And there was a guy there who was like in and out of jail, been there several years, and he had like 5 kids by 5 different women. And he's like, I'm not saying that because I'm nice, women should like me, but it seems like I should be doing better than that guy, right? Like he seems to have no problem hooking up with women. Like, why is it that he's able to and I'm not? What's the secret sauce? Not that he wants to be a misogynist asshole who treats women like shit. Um, but there's some kind of social dynamic happening there that is just a mystery. Um,
Mhm.
and I think a lot of guys look at that and go, "What? How is that possible?" It seems like the real assholes should never get girlfriends, because they're assholes. Yeah.
Can we reduce charisma to a set of techniques? Like I
Yeah.
feel like that feels like the question. And
Mhm.
like I think yes and no.
Right. Well, what you'll end up with is this guy ends up with a bunch of kids and he can't support them, and the women all dump him eventually. I mean, that's the back half of the book of the game. Is
Yeah.
like, sure, you can get a girl into bed, but after a while, she's going to know your real self. And
Yeah. Yeah.
you don't like fix that part. It's just going to be a string of, you can only go to a club so many times before it gets boring.
Mhm. Totally.
I sympathize with the need of like people to latch on to some sort of way to learn social dynamics. Um, I don't know if I'm super sympathetic to like the techniques that may be lined out in the book that you're referencing, although I haven't read it. But I do sympathize with like there needs to be some sort of like way to learn these skills for people who haven't.
The book is really good because it's not just like, here, do these tricks and they'll work, right? It's like
Hmm.
it's more about like, here's what women are looking for, and here's what you can communicate to them through different behaviors. And also what they're worried about, right? What they're, what's the joke? Like, worst thing can happen to a guy is he gets a drink thrown in his face. The worst thing can happen to a woman is she gets killed. Uh,
Hmm.
uh, in a sort of a interpersonal thing. And so like like I've always thought of myself as pretty harmless, but I can see why some women might think, oh, who's this big guy, getting up in my personal space, what's he want? What's he going to do to me? So a lot of it is about that, just sort of understanding like the the complaint of incels is a woman can get laid anytime she wants. But it's like, but that's not what women want. That's like saying, hey, you guy, you're so lucky you can eat ice cream. I mean, yeah, I guess I can do that, but I'm not going to do that every day all the time. So it's a lot about sort of understanding both kind of the motivations and the fears, as well as just like, here's lines you can say or tricks you can do. Um, the book
So,
I mentioned, Models by Mark Manson. He's the guy who wrote The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck. He actually started out as a pickup artist, and Models is a much more sort of honest. He goes deep into the psychology, um, of why you don't feel confident and how to sort of approach that and things like that. It's a much more honest approach to dating. It's not manipulative.
mm, there's this, I mean, the way that psychologists talk about, like, there's this concept of mentalizing, which is like this idea of being able to like hold in your mind a model of what another person's mind is like basically like theory of mind as a practice. And like they like build therapies around teaching people how to do that. And like, I think a lot of like personality disorders are modeled on are like kind of really about like people's ability or inability to mentalize accurately. And I think like there is this interesting thing with pickup artistry. And like maybe it just is a thing about gender. Like I think we're like in particular, there's this notion that like for men, for straight men, for cis men, it is impossible to mentalize women. Like
Mhm.
they just have like there's this cultural idea that like if you are a man, there is this block around what the heck is going on in a woman's head. And like obviously I've never experienced
Mm,
that. Like I am a queer person who basically primarily hangs out with other queer people. So like this kind of that particular way of inhabiting gender is like not something that I'm
Mhm.
particularly acquainted with. But I just find it's like I think what we're really talking about is like learning to mentalize people who you probably can mentalize, but think you can't mentalize. Like
Mhm.
and like that feels like really for me like the basis of anything that we might want to call people skills is like can you have a model of what it might be like to be another person in your head?
mm.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. Yeah.
And of
I
course that
love
can be
that we're
used for
talking about
evil. Yeah. But
I love that we're talking about gender silently.
I know. I hijacked it. I'm sorry.
No, you have two queer people here being like, "Oh, gender entered the chat." That's interesting. My initial response when you like brought up the idea of having a mental model of someone, I almost had like the opposite reaction where I was wondering like, is the problem of straight men, what might the problem of straight men be that like their idea of women is too centered around like a generic model of gender, like a generic model of femininity that they might have in their head that maybe like treats some aspects of a woman's inner life as just a black box and like chalks it up to like hysteria or periods. I don't know. This is like a reductive
yeah.
idea of femininity, but
I mean, I think having a stereotyped mental model or a generic mental model, like it's like no one ever doesn't have a mental model. Like I think this is a really important point. Like what you're saying is like no one ever lacks a mental model, but
Mhm,
for a lot of people, their mental models are cartoonish, usually like on the basis of like identity categories that they've just sort of blocked out with this cartoon that they've applied. Like,
mhm,
and that like actually learning to mentalize becomes about like not realizing that like everyone beneath like gender, class, race, what have you, is actually like a perfect snowflake, but rather like learning to hold like I don't know, systemic differences and like the specificity of an individual and into like a
mhm,
complex model that is like specific to them rather than like recoursing to that generic like
mhm,
and I think that's like the pitfall of like how pickup artistry in its I haven't read this book, DJ. Maybe it totally exceeds this. I have no idea, but I feel like pickup artistry generally will like teach you to apply a generic model that is maybe more sophisticated than the one that you already have of women, but like is still a generic model. And then
Yeah,
people run
I would
amok
say
with that.
so. I mean, and also just of that time, it's just a different world. I mean, that was almost 20 years ago, and so there's just really,
Totally.
I mean, that was before Tinder and things like that. The thing too, just about um, there is like I do think language sort of affects the way we think about it too, because the typical complaint of a man is that women are so emotional, they're so emotional. And my response is like prisons are full of very emotional men. But we've defined emotion to mean like crying or getting upset about something, but not like getting in a bar fight. That's not emotional. And it's just a different valence, but it's a similar mechanism. Um, and I mean, like Trump is like the bitchiest mean girl. Uh, I mean, he's so stereotypically feminine in so many ways. It's just shocks me that people think of him as like masculine at all. He wears makeup. I mean, he acts like a mean girl. So
Okay, we need to put a pin in this for salon number
Uh-huh.
2.
yeah.
Uh-huh. Totally.
I'm gonna sell tickets to this event. Why
Yeah.
why Trump is actually super feminine, and we're just gonna spend an hour unpacking that. That would be
I'm
great.
there. Let's do it.
There's
Yeah.
a great
Great.
Tom Nichols for the Atlantic wrote a piece back in like 2019 called Trump, America's least manly president or something like that. And Trump saw it and got so mad and wrote this like screed on Twitter about it. And it ended up like their subscriptions just went through the roof overnight because he got mad that someone called him unmanly.
Okay, so I do want to keep an eye on the time. We are at 8:33. This has been a lovely conversation. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here and contributing. Does anyone have like a final thought that they want to close the conversation out with? Read boundaries?
I'll just say I really liked the essay. It was very good.
Thanks, DJ.
For me, I think I'll be taking away this like the question of are we fundamentally eusocial or antisocial? I think that's going to stick with me. Um, as well as what are some other tools that we can add to our toolbox around communicating when we're in pain, communicating when we might need something from someone else, communicating around our vulnerabilities. I think I'll be reflecting on that.
Read the Social Antisocial Conversation. I think that David Graeber and David Wengrow's book, The Dawn of Everything, is really great on that. They really stage that and think through it in a really sophisticated way. But yeah. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Lily.
Thanks,
All
everyone.
right. Look out for the
Okay.
Trump is a bitchy mean girl salon.
All right.
Totally.
Yeah.
Good
Bye.
night.
Bye.